All right, guys, so we can go ahead and get started. Many of you are here, so again, welcome and thank you for joining us for a talk on Joaquim Tenreiro. My name is Mina. I'm the Director of Archives and Publications at R Company. I'm also a design historian specialized in Brazilian design. And we're here now to discuss a very special exhibition that we have on view at R Company, Joaquim Tenreiro Tectonic Master, which is on view through next week, October 26th. And to have this talk, I'm very happy to introduce our guest, Christian Larsen. Christian is a cultural historian and curator specialized in modern and contemporary art and design with a focus in Latin America. He's currently the Windgate Curator at the Museum of Arts and Design, MAD, in New York, and he's also the adjunct professor at Bard Graduate Center. And before these roles, he worked in the curatorial teams of the Met, the Wolfsonian, and MoMA. Christian is currently preparing an exhibition called Worldwide Wood, examining various tree species represented in MAD's collection, and he's also finishing his doctoral dissertation titled Aquarela do Brasil, Transnational Flows of Brazilian Design and Material Culture, both of which I'm already excited to see and read. So welcome, Christian.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk about Tenreiro with you.
Awesome. So yeah, if you want to go ahead and get our PowerPoint started, Michael. We've organized this talk to give a taste of the show for those who are unable to see it in person in New York, or for those of you who are in New York, you still have a week to see it, and maybe this is going to spark a burning desire to go there. And also to take a closer look at some of the masterworks created by Tenreiro. And the goal of this is to provide a deeper understanding of why we think he's one of the great design masters of the 20th century. And what we prepared for today is that I'll give first a brief overview of Tenreiro's biography with a little context of what was happening in Brazil. And then I want to pick Christian's brain in thinking about Tenreiro's life and work from a historical and critical perspective. And then we'll try not to nerd out and get too carried away, so there's time for questions and comments. So if you want to go to the next slide, Michael. So to start with the bio, this is Tenreiro. Joaquim Tenreiro was born in a small town called Melo in Portugal in 1906. His father and grandfather were woodworkers, and it is possible that his family worked in wood as far back as 5 generations. And by the time that he was 8 years old, Tenreiro started playing around in his dad's workshop. And then throughout his youth, he lived in his hometown of Melo, in Porto, also in Portugal, and in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil. And he permanently immigrated to Rio in 1928. Then he started taking some drawing classes, and he also started working as a carpenter in a small furniture shop as a proper job. At that point, modernism was a hot topic in Brazil, but in very restricted circles. So by the 1930s, the most fashionable, quote unquote, styles of furniture in mainstream markets was neo-colonial, which could include elements of Goth, neoclassicism, Baroque, Rococo. And by the early 1930s, Tenreiro became both involved in an art group that advocated for artistic freedom and was involved in modernist circles, but also started working for a high-end furniture firm called Laubisch Hirth that at that time employed 350 craftsmen. And because he had drawing skills, he was transferred to the design sector. And there he learned how to design in various revival styles and develop bespoke projects for entire homes. So if you want to move on to the next image. Here are some period ads from Laubisch Hirth, because it's worth noting that the company wasn't just making heavy old-fashioned furniture. They were also experimenting with versions of modern. So the ad on the left is from 1926, and the one on the right is from 1932. And Tenreiro started working there in 1933, likely making and designing both types of furniture. And these images, just by the way, are from the digitized collection of the periodicals of the Brazilian National Library. You can go back, sorry. So throughout the 30s, he worked in a couple other furniture firms and continuing also developing his career as a painter. By 1942, he was back at Laubischerth and then a client with an Oscar Niemeyer designed home, Oscar Niemeyer being the great modernist architect in Brazil who was at that point gaining recognition. So this client went to Laubischerth looking for furniture and he wanted modern furniture for his modern home. The project was eventually assigned to Tenreiro, and you can go to the next one now. And he created designs that were more modern and lighter than anything that the company had previously made, while still using traditional materials and manufacturing techniques. So these drawings are from the project that he made in the house. The project was executed and all this furniture existed. And some of it was clearly inspired by furniture being developed in Scandinavia, specifically Bruno Madsen comes to mind, but also the UK, the US. So he hadn't quite found his voice. But what is important here to see is that he was well aware of design developments happening in addition to his historical knowledge. So, but also at the same time, also in 1942, the same year that he made this project, he created what he considered his first fully authorial design, not done for Laubischerth, which is markedly different from these, which is the light armchair, which we'll talk about in a little while. So at that point, he decided to leave Laubischerth with another employee, and they started their own business. And initially, they were offering both modern furniture as well furniture in the English style, which is not entirely clear what English style he was referring to, but he said that offering period style furniture was a demand of his partner and English was the least ornamented. So we can even talk about this later, Christian, which one could it be? Maybe it's Sheraton. But if you want to go to the next one, Michael.
Maybe he's referring to arts and crafts movements and Macintosh, those type of unorganized.
Maybe. Yeah, because as far as I know, none of it survived, which is interesting. It should have the same label. It should also be the Tenreiro collectible, but as the story goes, so these images are from his store, the first one which he opened in 1947, and initially both modern and period furniture were being offered, but again, as the legend goes, all the modern pieces were sold before any of the traditional furniture. From that point onwards, they only exhibited Tenreiro's new designs. And so he quickly began furnishing interiors for homes designed by Niemeyer, Lúcio Costa, Sérgio Bernardes, Francisco Bologna, and others, which put him in direct contact and dialogue with these modern architects and circles. And over the next 2 decades, he opened a second store in São Paulo. He separated from his partner, and he built a name for himself as one of the biggest and best designers and decorators in Brazil. He was featured in newspapers, periodicals, not only showing his work, but also being interviewed as this authority in design, sometimes even as a guest editor. By the mid-1950s, his workshop, which had started with 15 carpenters, had 100 employees. And the main focus was creating full interiors, not unlike what he had done in the 30s, but now fully embracing his take on modern design. He was also responsible for furnishing some of the buildings in the new capital of Brazil, Brasilia, and business seemed to be booming until the late 1960s. Now, at that point, I'm trying to rush because I want to talk so much about so many things, but I just want to give the quick bio so I can start talking to Christian.
While you're on this point, though, of like this modern taste that's starting to be appreciated, right? That all of the modern pieces sold, but none of the historical pieces sold. It's maybe good to point out that this post-war period in Brazil was a huge boom in the cities, and they were building lots of new apartment buildings in a modern style with elevators and spaces that didn't fit or accommodate those big, heavy jacaranda 19th century pieces. Those historical pieces didn't match this new language. So all of a sudden, the modern style is something that people want, right?
Exactly. And there's this optimism, right? And Brazil is growing, and then there's the new capital, and it's finally going to be this great advanced nation. But then you cut to the late 60s, and Brazil's in a dictatorship. A lot of his peers are being persecuted or have left the country, so it's already a very different climate. At the same time, and paradoxically, industrial design is at long last being developed in Brazil, and industry is developing. And a lot of what Tenreiro was doing was now considered decoration or craft, both words that were frowned upon. And he was also getting older. He in interviews, he says he was tired of managing his business and wanted more time for his art. So all of these, these things kind of all add up. And so by 1970, he decided to close his furniture business. And from that point onwards, he took very few design commissions and mainly worked as a painter and sculptor for the rest of his life. So when we talk about Tenreiro furniture, we are talking 1942, 1968, basically. So if you want to go to the next image, Michael. So this was a first short version of the story. Here's a first view of the show at R Company, featuring several of Tenreiro's many chairs. And so, Christian, I thought we could start and end our conversation with a bold three-part question, which is, how do you view Tenreiro's place in design history in Brazil, in Latin America, and globally?
Right. I think starting with his reputation in Brazil, I tend to think that there was sort of a rediscovery of modernism and modernist furniture, right? It went really out of fashion by the 80s and 90s. This stuff was being dumped in junk shops, antique shops, and you could buy them very cheaply. They were totally unappreciated. Then by the late 90s, around 2000, right around when R Company starts to create a market for this in the United States, there's a kind of rediscovery, and Tenreiro emerges as really a father of modernism, maybe even the first to produce an authentically Brazilian modernism. So I think that he occupies a pioneer kind of status of making that transition from classical historical styles into the new language of the century. And he did it in a way that was very sensitive to other thinkers in the field. Lúcio Costa, the planner of Brasilia, another one of these, let's say, disciples of modernism. He was friends with Le Corbusier, and he was spreading the gospel through Brazil, creating new converts, new architects through his teachings about modernism. He wrote a really influential article about the continuity between historical styles and modernism, that there's a direct lineage and a root that you should preserve. Unlike the Europeans, who wanted to break all connection with the past. They wanted a radical new future, and they didn't want any connection to historical styles. The Brazilians really cherished this idea that there's a lineage that's continuing through time. So I think, you know, that in a sense separates Tenreiro, what Tenreiro was doing, and you can see it really well in the Windsor chair, that first chair on the left. That is one of the most classical vernacular archetypes of a chair that you could come across. Many societies have made it. We typically think of it as English, but look what Tenreiro did. He stripped it down to the bare essence, a minimalism. You couldn't get that structure any finer. It's like whittling wood down to the point where it might break. Those are almost toothpick thin, those spindles on the back. You think that they're going to snap. Tenreiro's genius is knowing that that jacaranda is super strong, very dense, and has a flexibility to it that allows him to create that structure. Very few masters of wood could understand their material to that degree and refinement. So that's one of the beauties of Brazilian design, and I think why Tenreiro emerges as a master within Brazil. As to the second part of your question, what is his reputation outside of Brazil? that's happening now. I mean, this conversation is part of disseminating knowledge about him. Brazil has really skyrocketed on the international market, even in the last 10, 15 years with auctions in Paris, Piazza. R Company has done a lot to create an appreciation and a growing market for this and rising prices. So it's, I think his reputation is yet to really settle in a more international context.
And so you mentioned a little bit about the Windsor chair, which we'll go back to. And I think one of the main points that we have to talk about in thinking about Brazilian modernism and Brazilian modern design has to do with wood, which I know you know a lot about. So if you want to go to the next one, Michael. I would like to hear a little bit of your thoughts on the tripé, or the three-legged chair, which you guys are seeing here, which Tenreiro designed in 1947. And he initially designed it for a play set, for this a play, and then he made it for clients. It wasn't something that he normally offered in the store. It was more almost like a thank you for people that commissioned the whole apartments. So on the left is a view of the chair, and on the right is an image of a historical image of the chair in a home in Rio, which I really like. This image is part of the R Company archives, and it looks like the chair is in a bathroom, which to us now, this chair, we find it so precious, we're scared to sit. But it's always good to remember that it was an actual chair that you could sit and use. But in any event, I would like to hear you talk a little bit about, I guess, to start with the technical prowess that is making this chair.
So in my opinion, this is Tenreiro's masterpiece. This is really the tour de force demonstration of what he can do with wood. And there's still some confusion in my mind as to how many of these he made and in what kind of combinations of wood. There's like I think the first one only had 2 different types of wood that are sliced, laminated, and then carved and joined. So you can't really see it, but where the back meets the seat in that swoop, that's where there's a kind of tooth formed joint. It's so well done that you don't even see it.
If you want to show the next image, Michael, there's a detail that might help.
A detail of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can kind of see there how there's breaks in the line right at the curve between the back and the seat. But the overall effect is this sculptural monocoque singular form that you start to see in this period, right? The Eameses with their lachaise, the Gaston Lachaise lounge chair is another version of this kind of sculptural gesture of a chair. But the genius here is his knowledge of, and I'm not sure how many types of wood, maybe there's 3 types of wood in this chair that you're showing on the left.
I think it's 4.
This maybe is 4.
Yeah.
I think he made them up to 5 different woods. Each wood, when you're thinking about Amazonian, Brazilian tropical hardwoods, you're talking about a material that is so loved because it's so hard and durable, insect proof, and it's almost like stone in a way. This, if you pick that up, it's heavy, not as heavy as a granite, but it's dense. The density of these woods are what makes the quality so high. If you carve it, it's actually can dull your blades because it's that dense. And they have different oil contents. They have different fiber structures. All of those things make working with these woods, you have to have a very specific knowledge. If you try to glue very oily woods together, sometimes the glue won't hold. Or if there's too much humidity or a lack of humidity, they shrink or expand, they crack. So there's very technical knowledge involved in knowing how you laminate those 5 woods and then how you can carve them into that beautiful form. The impression is this beautiful chair, but it doesn't surprise me it was in a bathroom, because it is it's a tough chair. It's not going to break. It is sturdy. And that's part of the allure, I think, for collectors today. This stuff is going to last. It's made to last, and the quality of the material is such that it will last.
And there's something in this chair, I also think, which he does a lot. And even though in this photo on the right, this is another view of the show where we can see that he also did many upholstered pieces. But the way that he was able to carve wood, there's that idea of the hard comfort that, even though it's simply wood, but the way that it's shaped, it's reminiscent of big, maybe Art Deco upholstered slipper chairs or other things like that, but it's just wood.
Yeah.
And it contours to the body in a way that
he understood the ergonomics such that you could lounge in this chair for a while without feeling tired or sore.
So if you want to go to the next one, Michael. So this is the light chair, which was the first chair that he designed independently. And I wanted to talk about it just after talking about the triped, because I think from a very different perspective, it seems like another really good example of the mastery in use of wood. In his idea, he called it the light. Even in Portuguese, it's called light sometimes, or levy. But his idea of lightness had little to do with weight, but it was much more about grace. And this image on the right, this is also part of the R Company archives, and I've zoomed in, with our with the little slide and with digitized versions. I can't tell, but it may be that this was done with laminated wood at some point instead of being upholstered. I've never seen it, but it looks like he did this experiment. So again, either whether upholstered or in wood. But what I wanted to ask you, Christian, about this chair is that this one is perhaps more similar to modern chairs being made in Europe and the US. Again, Scandinavia comes to mind. But what do you think makes this similar or different from what was being made north of the equator?
It's an excellent question. This is something that I've been toying with the idea of doing an exhibition, especially when I was at the Met. I thought it would be amazing to have a mid-century modern, global mid-century modern show where I would put into dialogue specifically Brazil, Italy, Scandinavia, United States, because those four centers, all of them are using Amazonian tropical hardwoods. So Brazil is exporting raw material. And then there's a language that they evolved that is really interesting to see if there's a dialogue going on between them. You already pointed out very early on that his first modern designs were almost a direct ripoff of Bruno Madsen with the kind of cross-hatched textile. There's a whole cadre of chairs that are very similar, and even the idea of lightness, trying to create a light chair. Marcel Breuer, very famously in the early 20s, designed a chair that was just a spring of air. Literally, it was just a conceptual idea, but what he was trying to achieve was lightness such that the chair itself disappears and you're sitting on a cushion of air. Joe Ponti designs the Superleggera. Also it was advertised by picking up with one finger. This is maybe a little heavier with that upholstered body, but the lightness of the structure is pretty incredible, and it's almost nothing. And to see how he joins the pieces of wood to create every curve and bend is really graceful and masterful. Later you see Zalzupin, also with his Dinamarquesa chair. He even says it's his Denmark chair. It's his Danish chair. So you know that they're in dialogue with each other. They're all looking at each other's work, and they're evolving this mid-century modern language.
So if you want to move on, Michael. So speaking again, going back to these guys, so we were talking about these similarities with modern production around the world. And these, which are all versions and reinterpretations of the Windsor chair, which is one of the things, and I think your mentioning of Costa's text is on point. This idea that Tenreiro wasn't, he aimed to break with the heavy furniture of the past, but not to break with the past itself. So he often drew, inspiration from all of these. And Michael, if you just want to move one more, for those of you who don't have the Windsor chair in mind, here are a couple examples of historical chairs from the 18th, 19th century. So, and you talked a little bit about it, but I also know that you've mentioned to me that you think this is one of the most elegant designs of all time. So if you could talk a little bit more about it, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, as I was mentioning before, the mastery of the material and the form in this chair is what really impresses me. I hard pressed to think of any other, not only designer. You have to be a maker. You have to understand how to make this thing with your own hands in order to truly appreciate it. The sophistication of the engineering of the structure, it's not entirely evident, but each of those spindles is set on an angle such that if those lines continued down underneath the seat, they would meet in a parabola shape. So it's a paraboloid structure that's dispersing any kind of weight or force along the rim of that back/arms of the chair, that singular curve. That force is all being distributed through each of those spindles. So it's underneath the seat, it's a fairly straightforward structure. It's just a box frame. There's that very elegant tapering of each leg so that it looks like a toothpick, which became a nickname in Brazil for this style of furniture, right? The toothpick, pé palito, toothpick legs. And then there's the caning. This is something else that really is an elegant standard in Brazilian furniture because of the climate, the humidity, the heat. You don't want to be seated on a solid surface of velvet upholstery or heavy fabrics or even leather. Your body will sweat in them. No, you want everything open, airy, light. Let the breeze run over your body, cool you. That's part of the design as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna say it's kind of hard to see from this angle, but the fact that there is the use of cane, which is another link to colonial furniture and to having this notion that we are always modern as Brazilians, modernist Brazilians like to say, or doomed to be modern, because you are already doing things as it was to a degree form following function.
Mhm.
You need it to be airy, that's why you choose the materials and whatnot. So go
I would
ahead.
say that it's scary to watch like a 250-pound man trying to sit in this chair. It's so delicate that you think, oh my God, this thing is going to snap, but it stays. It holds the weight.
It's been around for 70 years. And there's something about these chairs also that talks about, I think, Brazilian customs of people sitting and lounging and staying for a while. So they're not chairs that you just sit for a minute. You're supposed to relax on them. So, there's this austere look to it, but it also kind of invites relaxation.
Yeah, I mean, Brazilians are notorious for getting together and batendo papo. You chat, socialize. I had a luncheon with an architect who had an entire suite of these around her dining table with a biombo from Tenreiro. And we were there for hours talking, coffee, blah, blah, blah. Never even crossed my mind once of being uncomfortable in the chair. It was just blended into the environment.
So we could keep talking. I'm actually very quick anecdote. When I did my first interview to work at R Company, I was invited to sit in a Tenreiro chair, and I was like, "What? didn't know. And then once you see it, you're like, oh, this is amazing. It's such a weird notion when, again, when you look at these things, at these precious objects, and then they're also completely useful daily objects. But we could keep talking about specific pieces all day. But one of the things that made Tenreiro so exceptional is that he created the full interiors. So not only designing each individual piece, but also the overall layout of houses and apartments. And this is one of the main things that we wanted to show with the exhibition currently on view at R Company. So somehow emulating the interiors that these works came from. So here is a floor plan designed by Tenreiro for a home in Caraguazes in the 1950s. The first modern home, the Oscar Niemeyer home that he did, was also done in Caraguazes, which is a very small town in the state of Minas Gerais. And it's a modernist hub. And so throughout his life, he also designed furniture for a hotel there, for a school. And by the 1950s, he was commissioned to design this house. And the R Company archives have the estate of the owners of the house. So these were the floor plans that he made for the client, and the blueprints that the client had. And you can see that he's really working as an architect at this point, that he fully understands the architectural scale and how to create these environments. And he's not creating pieces, but he's really creating these rooms. So if you want to go to the next one, this is a view of the same apartment. Oh, the same house, excuse me. And so there's a few threads that we can pull from these and a couple more. But one of the things that, Christian, you could maybe start talking about is how you view the modern, and we started talking about just the idea of lounging and bate-papo, but how you view the modern ways of living in Brazil in the mid-20th century, because so far we've been talking about who was making the design, but who was buying it?
Right. My understanding, especially in the earlier years of these styles, in the 40s, and less so in the 50s, the clients who would have a taste for this would be elite, and they would be designing their entire house, the interiors. They would ask Tenreiro to do them. And Tenreiro was, he was a very fashionable choice for an interior designer. If you wanted this new modern style, you'd go to him. And so I think it's really great that we put these renderings of the overall interior concept in this presentation, so that you get a sense that Tenreiro had a complete vision. He was functioning as a decorator, interior designer, as well as mastering these individual objects within the interior. That's very rare. There aren't many interior designers today who I would say their individual pieces are of equal quality to the overall interiors that they do. They're either better in one thing or the other. Tenreiro did both exceptionally well. Maybe I prefer the designs more than the overall interior schemes. Sometimes the interiors they're not quite to my taste, but they are interesting, this language that he evolved. Everything's always very low to the ground and very horizontal. And I think that has a lot to, this is one of the tropes that we talk about in terms of recognizing a Brazilian style, especially with Sergio Rodriguez and other designers, that the furniture is always set low to the ground, sturdy, thick-legged. With Tenreiro, it's not thick. It's always, super thin and elegant. But that gravity being placed lower to the ground, that rootedness to the earth, earthiness, is something that you hear as characterizing Brazilian design.
You want to move on, Michael, one more? So these are a couple more sketches of interiors that he's done. And with these specifically, I agree that maybe it's the colors or something, but the taste is a little different than when we see the realized pieces and interiors. But I think talking about these, it's worth touching on the idea of provenance, because a lot of these pieces that we see today and that have made their way to us today came from these full commissions, and talked about the idea of collectability. You and I have talked about this before, that there's no direct translation to the word provenance in Portuguese. So, and when these interiors were made, no one would have predicted that, more than half a century later, they would be getting these new lives around the world, whether in someone's home or in a museum. If you want to go one more, Michael. So this is a home in Rio that was fully designed by Tenreiro, including the glass partition. Again, thinking about going into this interior design, almost architectural scale. And if you want to go one more, Michael, here's another view of the apartment on the left, and on the right is our exhibition at R Company. And so two-part question here. One, I know that you went with Zesty to this apartment, and I would love to hear your thoughts on being on this original design. And then to kind of leave it open-ended, but I'm also curious to hear your thoughts if you think that there's a certain Brazilianness or Brasilidade that is carried on with in these pieces, in these new incarnations, whether in our show or eventually in someone's home or something like that.
Yeah, it really comes alive when you go to the original commission space and you see everything in context as a whole idea. I learned so much with Zesty touring around Rio and Sao Paulo, visiting original commissions. The owner of that apartment is maybe in her 90s now, and maybe she even just died, I don't know. But it was, this is really the original generation who commissioned it directly from Tenreiro. So the provenance is absolutely immaculate. There's no question about these pieces. Whereas the market for Brazilian design is flooded with many fakes, because we see these rising prices, and it's possible to make these things brand new. Why not? But when you visit the original, maybe you can go to the previous slide. When you visit the original apartment, that everything is as it should be. And there's the things that surprise are some of the built-ins, right? That glass room divider is insane. I've never seen that anywhere else. And it's really smart too, because it allows light to filter between both spaces, it creates a visual barrier. And they have the most stunning view. If you go up to the window with the railing there, and you're looking out over the ocean and the bay. So it's spectacular. That bar as well in the background is also an amazing piece. So there's specific unique commission pieces for these interiors that you won't see anywhere else. Even if you see this armchair in many versions that come from many of the different interiors, things like that bar with that particular use of material and form, it's a unique piece.
And so if you want to go one more. So this is another bar, and he was really good at making gorgeous bars. And this one specifically, I think there's a very ingenious mixed use of materials, which sometimes we think Tenreiro, we think immediately wood, or wood and upholstery, but here we see he did do a lot of work in metal, and the stools have their metal legs. The front of the bar has these azulejos made by a Brazilian artist, Gina Bologna. The top of it is glass, underpainted glass. So it's almost, I think if he had started a decade or so later, he probably would have used Formica, but I think he started with the underpainted glass before there was Formica available. And ultimately it lasts more, it's more expensive, obviously, and again, the scale of this bar is always striking to me, because for one, the piece of wood that you have with no support going from one, it's the sandwich of glass and wood that makes it, stronger, but still, it predates MASP, the Museum of Art of São Paulo,
Yeah.
um, by a couple of decades, but it's almost the same kind of principle of working in this architectural scale and using all these different materials. And again, and maybe it's my eyes, and I'll ask you again, but there is a Brasilidade and a Brazilianness that I think you can't miss with a piece like this. This is almost like the MASP, the Ministry of Education in the 1930s in Brazil turned into furniture to me.
Yeah. If you, yes, I think you're right. Absolutely right. The structures, these kind of long horizontal spans, low, the massing is absolutely modern. The materials, the wood, obviously, and then azulejos are a key signifier of Brazilianness. It's such a, well, Portuguese, by way of Portugal, coming into Brazil, these tiles. You actually know the name of the artist who did these tiles?
Yes, I'm pretty sure. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I'm pretty sure her name is Regina Bologna, but I'll double check, and I'll get back to you. So nobody write it down. It's in the label in the show. You're gonna have to go to the show and make sure.
But that's so typical of Brazilian design and architecture, right? It's so many surfaces covered with different types of tessellations and tiles. So yeah, once you start thinking about Brazilianness in terms of the materials, forms, it's very evident that this is a Brazilian type. Also, it's a bar. Brazilians love their pinga, you need your cachaça caipirinha. So it's part of socializing.
And the scale also, so the image on the left is in the original home. And if you want to just go one more, Michael. So again, this is a view of our show with the bar. It also demands, even though we are already talking about people that are living in apartments and no longer houses, so there is a limitation of space, and you can't build a puxadinho or an annex, so you already have to be smarter with the scale and furniture that has to also serve as room dividers, hence the biombos and things like that. But it's still very wealthy, very large apartments. It's not for the lower middle classes whatsoever.
That's part of the luxuriousness, this horizontality, right? It's not modern, it's not vertical stacking. You have this sense of ampleness of space. If you sit in those club chairs that, a big body can comfortably lounge in them. It's that's where the luxuriousness comes in.
Yeah, the stools, if you look at them, they are so wide. Each stool is as long as two would be.
Yeah, it's ample, it's extra.
And so in light of what we've talked about so far, and to make sure we have time for questions, I'll ask you again, and so you can add anything else. How do you view Tenreiro's place in design history in Brazil, in Latin America, and globally?
Yeah. Master of wood, master of modern form. And I think your title for the exhibition really sums it up. Tectonic Master, right? There's a sense of construction to the pieces that he mastered his material and the form. Yeah, I think it's also interesting to look at him in dialogue with the other masters in the United States, Denmark in particular, and Italy. Each one has its own particular accent and way of producing a modern style, right? There's almost national styles that are emerging in this furniture, and yet they're all of the same spirit. You can tell that it's the same movement, and they're influencing each other.
Do you think Tenreiro was influencing people outside of Brazil?
Unclear to me if he had much influence on, say, the Scandinavians. I tend to think, though, that there was a dialogue happening. We know as early as the New York World's Fair, right? A lot of the press was putting forward Finland and Brazil as the two nations that were forging ahead a new modern language that was completely different. It was organic. It was sensitive to the environment, indoor and outdoor. And so you already see at that early date that Brazil and Scandinavia are the leaders in what would emerge as mid-century modern. And there were plenty of publications that were publishing these things. I would tend to think that Tenreiro would have been lesser known outside of the country, though. It was maybe more that he was, but you know, that work remains to be done. An actual trying to chart publications and how they were distributed.
Yeah, because my guess would be, his furniture was featured in the interiors that we know were being published. So in the Costas and Niemeyer's.
Exactly.
And Tenreiro also wrote regularly at Modulo, Niemeyer's magazine,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm pretty sure at least the Europeans were somewhat aware of. But
Modulo
at the
was
same,
distributed. It was distributed by Pan Am, actually, on international flights. If you were going to or from Brazil, you would get a copy of Modulo magazine.
That's amazing.
And Niemeyer started the magazine in order to critique Max Bill and Walter Gropius and all of these Europeans, and there were some Americans as well, who were very judgmental even about modernism in Brazil. Max Bill said that what Brazil was doing was barbarous jungle growth, because he literally said that, because it was insensitive to the plight of poor, starving people on the streets. You know, there's always been such a disparity in Brazil between the mega rich and the mega poor. And that can be shocking to a European visitor coming to Brazil in 1951 for a biennial of art. And he's looking at this new modern architecture that's housing a more elite class. And then you see poor people on the street. So you can understand why Max Bill was saying these things, but it also reads as this pejorative outsider view that fails to understand the country. So Niemeyer started the magazine to say, like, we're very proud of this progress, and we're putting it, we're forging a new future with a new national capital in a language and a way of moving through space that's never been done before. You know, like, that was the pride of Brazil, and all of this aesthetic is part of that.
And it goes, and by the way, if anyone has questions, you can ask them in the chat, or you can raise your hand or do the other functions that Zoom has. Otherwise, we're just going to keep chatting. We will keep chatting, but if questions come in, we'll stop to address them. And it's also worth noting, speaking about Niemeyer and Modulo, that Tenreiro pretty much aligned with that current of modernism in Brazil, right? So, and Max Bill's critiques that were published in Habitat magazine, that was run by Lina Bobardi, which at that point had some type of antagonism with those currents of modernism and Niemeyer, and whose design was also to a degree searching for a type of industrialization, whereas Tenreiro was very much proud of the carpentry aspect and the one-of-a-kind handmade aspect of his work, which I think ultimately by the end of the 60s is what starts, sorry, I just got distracted, which starts changing his place. I think he was very used to this very prominent position by the 50s and 60s. And then as design develops, he, there's exhibitions. Pietro Bardi did a show in 1970 and did it in Tenreiro, and he was very sour, a design exhibition on Brazilian furniture. So I think this type of making, it's not, it kind of ends when he stops at the same time.
Yeah, you were absolutely right. And correct in mentioning that there was a rivalry between Rio and Sao Paulo, and the school of architecture that emerged in both were very different. This further underscores how culturally diverse and rich Brazil is. That the fact that these two cities would have evolved completely different styles of architecture and design. Rio predicated on lightness, thin concrete shell of structure that's meant to float, very sculptural, and Sao Paulo, which was brutalist, which was technocratic, which had a heaviness to its language. And Lino Bobardi was very much Sao Paulo, and Niemeyer and Tenreiro were much more carioca. Although Tenreiro had shops in both Rio and Sao Paulo, right? He had his stores.
Yeah, his store was in São Paulo, was actually for a long time at Conjunto Nacional. So another modernist icon. So we have a question, a raised hand by Kirk. If Michael, you want to let him make his question? You just have to unmute yourself.
Oh yeah, you're muted, Kirk.
Christian?
Yeah.
This is Kirk Brown in Denver.
How are you? Great to hear you. I can't see you. Hear you. Nice.
Say, well, a question. What did his art look like, and how did it relate to his furniture, his designs?
Oh, Tenreiro's art. After he stops his design
Right.
practice, only moved. Good question. We should have put a few pictures into the slides. He continues to work with wood. A lot of the sculptures are wood. It's his preferred material, his mastered material. And it's interesting, they're very geometric and abstract, architectural and structural, but in a completely different way than furniture. There's no function needed anymore, but they have a kind of serial repetition to them. How would you describe them, Mina?
I would say they're pretty much concretist. You know, even though he's doing it after concretism.
It's not even neo-concretist. It's concretist, yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
It's in the style of Max Bill, but in I would say
paradoxically,
like an extruded Max Bill. They tend to also be very horizontal or vertical columns.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
And his paintings, interestingly, remain pictorial for the longest time. So he wasn't full abstract geometry. So we have one more question here. How were the three masters in Brazilian design, Tenreiro, Zanini, and Sergio Rodrigues, able to stay as individuals and pressure their own passions in such, sorry, let me just reread it so I don't get confused. So how the question is basically how the three big, what we now consider the three big Brazilian masters, whose styles are drastically different but somehow all very Brazilian, Tenreiro, Zanini, and Sergio Rodrigues, able to stay with their individual styles and their individual passions in one style didn't dominate after the other, or it didn't become a fad in all the cities. So how did their practice remain so authorial, I guess is.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was reading a text recently of Sergio Rodrigues' memory of Tenreiro and first meeting him. Tenreiro was a little bit, he was more senior than the other two, for example. So there's generational difference. But there's a kind of attitude difference as well. Maybe Tenreiro brought some of his Portuguese-ness with him to Brazil. You see Tenreiro as a kind of like refined character, that minimalist essence, the thinness, the lightness. Sergio Rodrigues was more voluptuous, let's say, bombastic, meteor, and they would critique each other. They, Tenreiro would say, I don't know what you're doing, Sergio, is not really to my taste. But I understand what you're doing. Your mole chair, there's one thing I would change. The back is straight, you should curve it. So, they would give each other these little hints. And Sergio really wanted Tenreiro to be on the square Osório in Ipanema, so that all of the modernist designers had representation on that square. So they very easily coexisted with each other in Rio, catering to the same market, and their styles were quite different. Sergio with his kind of thickness, Tenreiro with his skinniness, and Zanini is a whole other topic. He needs his own session.
Fair enough. Well, on that note, I think we can wrap it up, unless Christian, you have any other thoughts,
I'm
comments?
all good here.
So thank you very, very much for sharing your thoughts with us for the past hour. And thank you very much for all of you who were watching us. The show will be on view until next week. Christian will be at the gallery on Monday with Zesty, and they're gonna see the show, talk about the pieces. So if you're able to attend, do so. And if not, we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Mina.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.